November 21, 2016. The Panama Canal. The most advanced warship ever built was being towed by tugboats. She had cost more than $4 billion. She was 610 feet long, longer than any destroyer or cruiser in the United States Navy. Her hull was shaped to fool radar into seeing a small fishing boat. Her engines produced 78 megawatts of electricity, the same as a nuclear aircraft carrier. The Navy called her the future of naval warfare. A four-star admiral had said that if Batman had a ship, it would be this one. And now she sat dead in the water, her propeller shafts flooded, her drive motors silent, scraping the concrete walls of the canal locks while small boats dragged her to a berth. Her name was Zumwalt. She had been in commission for exactly 37 days. Captain James Kirk stood on her bridge. Yes, that was his real name. A Maryland native, a graduate of the Naval Academy, and now the first commanding officer of the strangest warship his country had ever launched. He had called her a marvelous piece of technology. He was not wrong, but standing there in the heat of Panama, waiting for the tugs, he was learning the lesson this ship would teach the whole Navy over the next 10 years. You can build the perfect weapon for a war, and then the war can simply refuse to arrive. This is the story of a ship that did everything it was asked to do. It was the world that changed underneath it. To understand the Zumwalt, you have to go back to the early 1990s. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. The long standoff that had defined the world for 50 years was over, and the United States Navy suddenly had no enemy on the open ocean. There was no rival fleet to fight, no great battle line waiting somewhere over the horizon. The Navy looked at the future and saw something new. The wars to come, the planners decided, would be fought close to shore, in the shallow waters near coastlines, against smaller countries and regional troublemakers. The Navy called these the littorals. So in 1991, they started dreaming up a new family of warships. They called the project the 21st Century Surface Combatant. These ships would not duel other navies. They would sit off a hostile coast and pound targets far inland. They would support Marines storming a beach. They would be the heavy hitters of the small wars everyone expected. There was just one problem. The Navy had recently retired its last battleships, the great Iowa-class giants from the Second World War. With them went the only guns that could reach deep onto land. What was left were 5-inch guns that could only throw a shell about 13 miles. And here was the catch. By the 1990s, enemy missiles on the coast were getting good enough that a ship had to stay at least 25 miles offshore just to survive. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. 25 miles out, with guns that only reached 13. The math did not work. American warships could no longer reach the shore they were supposed to dominate. The new ship would fix that. It would carry a gun that could fire a precision shell more than 70 miles inland and drop it within a few feet of the target. It would do the work of a battleship. It would bring naval gunfire back from the dead. The program went through name after name. First, it was the DD-21. Then it was reworked and called the DDX. Finally, it became the DDG-1000, and the lead ship was named for Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, a Vietnam veteran and one of the most respected reformers in Navy history. And the ship they designed was, frankly, a monster. Look at her, and you would not believe she was a warship. Most ships flare outward above the waterline. The Zumwalt did the opposite. Her sides sloped inward as they rose, a shape called tumblehome, like a knife blade standing on end. It made her look like something from a science fiction film. But every flat angle, every hidden surface, had one purpose: to scatter radar waves and make a 16,000-ton warship nearly invisible. And it worked. Despite being larger than a cruiser, the Zumwalt showed up on radar as something the size of a small fishing boat. An enemy could be looking right at her and see almost nothing. Inside, she was just as radical. Old destroyers ran on engines bolted straight to the propeller shafts. The Zumwalt ran on electricity. 2 large gas turbines and 2 smaller ones spun generators, and that power ran everything. The propellers, the sensors, the weapons, all of it. She produced 78 megawatts. That is enough electricity to run a small city. The Navy built her that way on purpose because they were already dreaming of future weapons, lasers and railguns that would need enormous amounts of power. She was also nearly empty. A normal destroyer of that era carried about 300 sailors. The Zumwalt was so automated she needed only about 150. Computers ran the fire suppression, computers moved the ammunition. One Navy admiral joked that the ship practically sailed itself, but the heart of the whole design, the entire reason she existed, sat up front on her deck. 2 enormous guns, the advanced gun system. Each one was a 155mm cannon fed by an automatic magazine holding hundreds of rounds. Together, they were meant to be the largest naval guns in the fleet. They could fire 10 rounds a minute, each shell flying more than 70 miles and landing with pinpoint accuracy. This was the promise. A single Zumwalt, sitting safely far offshore, could rain precision fire on an enemy dozens of miles inland again and again for the price of an artillery shell instead of a $1 million cruise missile. For the Marines, it was the return of the battleship. For the Navy, it was the future. The Navy wanted 32 of these ships, and that number, 32, is where this story turns. Because the Zumwalt was not just advanced, she was expensive. Wildly, breathtakingly expensive. Every new technology that went into her, the stealth hull, the electric drive, the automated guns, the custom radar, the special composite deckhouse, all of it cost money to invent from scratch. And as the bills came in, Washington got nervous. So they started cutting. 32 ships became 24. 24 became 7. And in 2008, the Navy did something almost unheard of. It asked Congress to stop building its own flagship program. It wanted to go back to building the older, cheaper, proven Arleigh Burke destroyers instead. Members of Congress were stunned. They pointed out that the Navy had just spent something like 13 years and $10 billion developing this ship, and now wanted to walk away after only a handful. In the end, the number landed at 3. 3 ships. The Zumwalt, the Michael Monsor, and the Lyndon B. Johnson. The entire program, all the research and all 3 hulls, came to about $22.5 billion. The cost overrun was so severe, it triggered something called a Nunn-McCurdy breach, an automatic legal alarm that goes off when a weapons program blows past its budget by a set amount. The Zumwalt had blown past it by 50%. And here is where the cuts became a catastrophe. Because cutting the fleet from 32 ships to 3 did not just leave the Navy with fewer ships, it broke the gun. Remember those 2 enormous cannons, the whole point of the ship? They could not fire normal artillery shells. Their automatic magazines were built for one specific round and one round only. A custom-made, rocket-boosted, satellite-guided projectile called the Long-Range Land Attack Projectile. When the Navy planned to build 32 ships, it planned to buy thousands and thousands of these shells. Mass production would bring the price down. Each round was supposed to cost around $50,000. Pricey for a shell, but reasonable. But when the fleet shrank to 3 ships, the order for shells collapsed with it. Suddenly, the factory was building a tiny handful instead of thousands. And the price did not just rise, it exploded. By 2016, each single shell cost between $800,000 and $1 million. Stop and think about that. 1 round. For the same price, the Navy could fire a Tomahawk cruise missile that flew farther, hit harder, and was more accurate. The gun that was supposed to be the cheap alternative to missiles now cost as much as missiles, just to pull the trigger once. So, in November of 2016, the same month the Zumwalt was being towed through Panama, the Navy made the only decision it could. It cancelled the shell. It stopped buying the ammunition. And just like that, the most expensive destroyer in American history had two of the largest guns in the fleet, and nothing to fire out of them. The Navy had built a ship around a weapon and then thrown the weapon away. Each Zumwalt now carried 670 empty gun barrels worth of magazine space and no rounds to fill it. The guns sat on the deck, sealed up, the Navy quietly admitting they were being delivered in what it called an inactive state. Inactive, a polite word for useless. A retired naval officer put it bluntly. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. The Zumwalt, he said, had become a ship in search of a mission. It is worth pausing on how strange this was. Sailors who had served on the ship spoke of her with real pride. She handled beautifully. The crew was sharp and hand-picked. The technology, when it worked, was genuinely a generation ahead of anything afloat. Captain Kirk, when the ship finally limped into San Diego in December of 2016, said he could not express enough how proud he was of his crew for getting her to the West Coast. The people were not the problem. The ship was not even really the problem. The problem was that nobody could answer a simple question. What was she for? She had been imagined in 1991 for a world without great rivals, a world of small coastal wars where her giant guns would shine. But the world did not stay still. By the time she actually sailed, the era of small wars was fading and the era of great power competition was roaring back. China was building a navy at a staggering pace. New ships, new missiles, new ambitions. The threat was no longer some warlord on a coastline. It was a peer competitor across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. And in that world, a ship designed to creep up to a shoreline and bombard it with guns was answering a question nobody was asking anymore. The Navy had spent more than 2 decades and over $20 billion building the perfect tool for a war that quietly walked off the stage. For a while, it looked like the Zumwalt might just become a very beautiful, very expensive embarrassment. A footnote, a cautionary tale taught at war colleges about what happens when you bet everything on predicting the future. But the story does not end there. Because the same thing that doomed the Zumwalt also eventually saved her. That enormous electric power plant. All that space up front where the useless guns sat. The fact that she had been overbuilt from the keel up, designed with room to grow. By the early 2020s, the Navy was desperate for a new kind of weapon. Hypersonic missiles. Weapons that fly at more than 5 times the speed of sound, maneuvering as they go, almost impossible to shoot down. Both China and Russia were racing ahead in this field, and the United States was scrambling to catch up. These missiles are big, much too big for the standard launch tubes on a regular destroyer. They needed a ship with space, with power, and with the stealth to get close before anyone knew it was there. Someone looked at the Zumwalt with its useless guns and its enormous capacity and saw not a failure but an opportunity. In August of 2023, the Zumwalt sailed into a shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and the surgeons went to work. They cut the 2 great guns out of her bow. The cannons that had defined her entire reason for being, the weapons the whole $20 billion program had been built around, were simply removed and hauled away. In their place went 4 large missile tubes. Each tube could hold 3 hypersonic missiles, 12 in total. The weapon is called Conventional Prompt Strike, a missile developed alongside the United States Army, built to hit a target thousands of miles away with only minutes of warning. No nuclear warhead, just speed, reach, and the element of surprise. The work took years. Cutting open a warship and rebuilding her bow around a brand new weapon system is one of the most complicated conversions in modern naval history. The Navy even added extra fuel capacity so the ship could roam the wide Pacific on long patrols. By the end of 2025, the work was nearly done. In November of that year, the Navy officially finished installing all 4 launchers. The plan is for the Zumwalt to set sail and begin testing her new fangs in 2026, nearly 10 years after she first broke down in the Panama Canal. Her sister ship, the Lyndon B. Johnson, has already had her own guns torn out and is being rebuilt the same way. The third ship, the Michael Monsoor, will follow. And so, the ship built to fire the largest guns in the fleet will go to sea with no guns at all. Instead, she will carry some of the fastest, most fearsome missiles in the American arsenal. The very first warship in the United States Navy able to launch a hypersonic weapon from the open sea. The vessel, designed for a world of small coastal wars, has been reborn for a world of great power rivalry. The Zumwalt, written off by half the experts in Washington, may yet become exactly what the moment requires. Now, there is a temptation to tell this story as a simple tale of failure, a boondoggle, a monument to government waste, and the numbers certainly invite it. $22 billion, 32 ships shrunk to 3. Guns with shells that cost $1 million each, then no shells at all. A flagship its own Navy tried to cancel before it was even finished. But that telling misses something deeper and more human. The men and women who designed the Zumwalt were not fools. They looked at the world in front of them in 1991, made the most reasonable prediction they could, and built brilliantly toward it. Almost every individual piece of the ship worked. The stealth worked. The power plant worked. The automation worked. The hull sliced through the sea exactly as designed. What failed was not the engineering, it was the prophecy. They bet on one future, and history handed them a different one. That is the real lesson buried in the steel of this ship. A weapon is only as good as the war it is built to fight. You can pour decades of genius and tens of billions of dollars into a perfect machine, and if the world simply changes its mind about what kind of war is coming, your masterpiece becomes a puzzle nobody can solve. The Zumwalt was not destroyed in battle. No enemy ever fired a shot at her. She was nearly undone by something far harder to defend against than any missile. By time, by change, by the slow, quiet way that the future you plan for drifts away from the future that actually shows up. And yet there is a final twist, and it is the most important one. The Zumwalt survived. Not because she was used as planned, but because she was built with room to become something else. Her greatest weakness, the over-engineering that made her so expensive, all that extra power and space and capacity, turned out to be the very thing that gave her a second life. The ship was too big, too powerful, too ambitious for her original job, which is exactly why she could grow into a new one. When the Zumwalt finally puts to sea armed with hypersonic missiles, she will be one of the most formidable warships on the planet. The fishing boat Ghost on the radar will now carry weapons that can strike a continent away in minutes. The strange science fiction destroyer that broke down in Panama, the ship nobody knew what to do with, will have outlived every prediction of her doom. She was built to fight America's enemies in a war that never came. She spent years as a weapon in search of a purpose. And in the end, the world changed one more time, and finally, at last, came looking for her. The most advanced warship ever built was once towed helplessly through the Panama Canal. 10 years later, she may sail out as the future after all.